Thank you very much for this opportunity. I've really been looking forward to this very important panel discussion. So now I would like to invite my panelists also on the stage. Hege Skarrud, who's the president of Spire in Norway. And Ndema Mwamakamba from the FANRPAN network. And finally also Ben Reynolds, who's Deputy Chief Executive from Sustain United Kingdom. So I would like to take departure in the very interesting presentations we had this morning, because as outlined by Andrew Campbell, it's obvious that we need to collaborate. The scale and the magnitude of the problem that Henrik Wigner showed us is so important that both farmers and social movements, they need to set aside any prejudice they may have against each other. There is an urgent need really for working together on transforming the food system towards achieving the SDGs and meeting the goals of the Paris Agreement. As we have just heard from Anne Aron, then farmers are already working on this. They are working on solutions to reduce their emissions, and they are working on solutions to sequester carbon. So they have set aside, they are on this track. Also, as mentioned by Tony, there's also a third pathway, which is dealing with, you could say, the healthy, sustainable diets. And also farmers are also starting to investigate this option and looking into, at least to some extent, to convert the animal feed production to plant-based food production, to also meet the increasing demand for plant-based food. So what is the role of social movements and consumers in all this? How can social movements work together with farmers and the food sector? How can consumers make a difference? So Hege, you are the president of Spire. It's a youth organization based in Norway, working for a just and sustainable distribution of the world's resources. How do you see the role of Spire and other social movements in fostering change in the food system, and how do you see the options for collaborating with farmers?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. And as I'm representing an organization that's working on a very narrow topic, changing the whole distribution of the world's resources, I have a lot to say. But first of all, I would like to just say, because we already, from the first video, we were looking at what is transformation. That is very good, because we were then talking about transformation is radical, it's holistic, it's challenging the status quo. But we're not talking about what is the food system yet, because from working with food systems, thinking, and also challenging the current food system for a few years now, it's kind of starting to become, as the term sustainability, it's washed out. People use it as they want, because food system isn't just about the distribution or the value chain from production to waste. It's also about the systems that's encompassing this whole food system, trade system, economic system. So we need to be aware of these things in order to actually get the transformation that we want. And that's why I changed from having this very consumer-based idea in my head and how I was trying to transform this system, because I used to be a vegan. That was how I thought that this is how I'm going to change the food system. But then I realized that, well, actually the food system is bigger than just that. It's more than just that. So now I'm in the middle of a social movement. What is actually the food system? The food system is more. The farmer isn't producing food just for the farmer, it's producing food for all of us. And the farmer is also taking care of the biodiversity, cultural landscape, cultural heritage. It's also creating a lot of different jobs around the world. It's kind of the cornerstone of our societies. So how do we lift this? How do we as a social movement actually talk to farmers, and how do we also talk to people who are consumer based in their idea of changing the system? How do we get vegans and farmers to actually discuss together and actually kind of pull the same way, because I think that's the kind of where we're lacking right now. And why we're lacking is because we think through consumer-based change, the consumer knows everything. The consumer has every single form of information by hand or already have it in, have the knowledge when they make the decision in the shop, but we don't, and it's impossible to have it. So having an idea, both in the social movement, but in policy making and as consumers and also in businesses, is very important. We don't work as much with businesses because we want to change how business works. We don't want a business that's only motivated by economic growth. But we need to change. We can't put economic growth in the middle. We need to put it on the side and put nature in the middle. As long as something's not going the right way for the nature, then we won't have economic growth. But if we can have both, then fine. It doesn't really matter. But the way we're trying to change the state, like the status quo right now, it's not changing the status quo, it's just nudging it a little bit. It's cost shifting. So for us, this whole social movement it's important, because if transformation is going to be radical, then we need radical voices. And those voices are only apparent within social movements. It's not apparent within consumer-based change, because we don't really know why the consumer is making the decision that they're doing.
Thank you very much, Hege. That are, I think, very important points, and I'm sure there will be some questions for the audience on that. First, I would like to invite also Sithembile. You're the program manager for climate smart agriculture in FANRPAN, which is an organization working to support policies for food secure Africa. So we have now heard from Hege how things look from her perspective in Norway. What would you say are the most important challenges and opportunities for transforming the food system in Africa? And how can social movements also across the world best support farmers, local farmers, in achieving also food sovereignty?
Thank you for those questions, and a good morning to everyone. So I was just listening to Hege, and I was thinking, the idea of social movements strikes fear in the heart of our leaders in Africa, because we have seen the power of social movements. The Arab Spring, it began in Tunisia, Egypt, and Libya. And we know what happened to those countries. The young people toppled governments. But we have also seen in recent years, in South Africa, for instance, there's been a social movement around fees must fall, right? Where young people have said enough is enough. We want, to see a stop of this. We want to have access to higher education, and the fees are just too high. So each time we bring up the issue of social movement, I think it strikes fear into the heart of leaders. Just this morning, I was watching news on BBC, and it was showing a map of how governments turn on and off the internet whenever there's demonstrations, whenever there's sort of campaigns of some sort. So I was thinking that perhaps within the food systems and agriculture space, we haven't gotten to that part, where we strike fear at the heart of our governments, because we have not seen that change, which means perhaps the problem is not big enough, or we are not crying out loud enough. So really, if we look at what the social movement has done in the political space, and we look at the challenge that our food systems and agriculture sector is facing, I think we need to cry a bit more. And there's need for collective action around making sure that the challenges ahead and the solutions are also presented so that we'll galvanize action to address this. The other issue that you brought is the idea of food sovereignty. In itself, I think the concept of food sovereignty is really about building social movements. It's about empowering people to organize, and it's about making sure that there's a collective voice. But when you think about it, the issue of food is also a political thing. So we can't run away from that. And what my organization, the Food, Agriculture, Natural Resources and Policy Analysis Network, does is that we try to provide an even platform where civil society, government, researchers, farmers, and business come together to dialogue on these issues. And we have been working to make sure that we raise the alarm around the need for urgent action when it comes to transforming our food and agriculture systems. And I think one of the things that, as a network, we have been looking at is how do we make sure that the people who are not traditional actors within the policy space have their voices heard within that space. Because a lot of the decisions are made, but without the input of the people that are most affected. So what we have been trying to do is to make sure that the farmers' voices are also heard in the policy spaces. I think maybe I'll talk a bit more as we go on with the panel.
Okay, thank you very much, Tembi, for a very interesting perspective on that. I would like to, before we take questions from the audience, I'd like to hear from you, Ben, also. You are from Sustain in the UK that has successfully actually supported sustainable food system policies and practices through an extensive number of projects and campaigns. So what can we learn from your experiences at Sustain on how to empower citizens and make it easier for them to make informed decisions and also contribute to this food system transformation?
Thanks, Christian. You said about sort of making more informed decisions, and I think it just picks up your point. We need to be crying out more loudly. Can I just have a show of hands? Are there any journalists in the audience? Media? 1, 2. We run lots of events in the UK, and it's probably similar. Not enough journalists in the room. We need to be telling better stories, more convincing stories, because we need to be getting this narrative out into the media space. That's the way in which you shift public opinion. That's the way in which you shift the opinion of policymakers. You know, we need to be helping media to sell papers, to get click-throughs with the stories that we want to tell. And that means telling better stories, using less academic language and stuff that people can really engage with. We need to use fear, you know, the risks facing our food system. We need to use fun. They kind of celebrate the best throughout the food system and those wonderful things around the solutions that we're putting. And we need to tell the truth as well. I think that's really important. But no, that's I think is one of the big challenges. And I think one of the big themes today is sort of working together. So Sustain is an alliance of about 100 different NGOs, civil society organizations, ranging from very small to very large, some of the largest charities in the UK, conservation groups, health organizations, trade unions, a mixture of completely what would be seemingly different perspectives, but for whom we can find consensus around specific issues. And I think that's the thing, that's the way in which we collaborate, is to say, okay, great, we're meeting. People are tired of meeting. We need to find action. We need to find those things that we agree on where we can really push forward. So for us, those are, that's from grassroots action through to national business policy, government policy. So it's things like the sugary drinks tax, which we pushed for in the UK and won somehow. It's for things like the London Olympics, the 2012 Games, where we managed to get commitments from this global behemoth to using all fair trade tea, coffee and sugar. All the fish was sustainable, free access to drinking water. And we did that by bringing those civil society groups around the table, bringing businesses around the table. It was a very interesting moment for us when we had government officials from DEFRA saying, we're not sure we should rock the boat on sustainable fish. And then one of the leading fish industries saying, well, of course it's all going to be sustainable. Why wouldn't it be? So that was, I don't see it as a kind of business over there and government over there. I think it's important to remain unbiased, but these are the guys who are feeding us, the farmers and businesses. We need to work with them. We need to say this is what good looks like and see one by one how can we get them to meet those voluntarily, and then ultimately when we need to have that level playing field to get government to step in and create those sort of policy changes. I see just one more point I wanted to make, I suppose, is also to think about it not as consumers, but as food citizens. And this for us has been a really big, important shift that we're trying to push. I mean, it's really important to vote with your purse, to kind of go out and buy organic, fair trade, and climate-friendly food, if you can work out what that is on the label. That's a challenge. But also, I think it's about how do we mobilize people to start enterprises, to grow the alternative, as well as mobilizing them, at a place-based level, through to kind of national level, to start to sort of change the system and to kind of shift some of those business policies.
Okay, yeah. I'm of course really happy that you mentioned that, because that is going to be one of the focus areas of our Food Shift 2030 project, to empower both citizens and entrepreneurs in this food system transformation. So I would like to actually hear from the audience now some questions for the panel. So I can believe there should be tons of questions. Yeah? Sophie?
Thank you.
Yeah.
My question is for you.
Maybe
Hege.
you can just say briefly who you are and then the question. Yeah.
My name's Sophie Healy-Thau. I'm a student in Ireland, but also a youth activist working within the washed out term, as you phrased it, the food system. But I'm really interested in what you're doing in Spire, because it's quite unique, I think, as a youth organisation that works directly within the food system. I was wondering how you did that. How do you get young people interested? Are they already interested? Do you have to change their minds in some respects, or just how you work?
That's a very good question. I wasn't interested in the food system at all when I started in the Spire. I didn't really think when I was 22 years old and had green hair and lived in England that I would be talking about agriculture and food systems in a few years. But for us, it's how the systemic flaw is put into kind of a case. It's very visible within the food system how power relations are very unjust, but it's also how the trades, so in the trade system, for example, and how some people are constantly having the power to impact someone else's food security and food sovereignty. How do we produce food isn't managed by a country anymore. It's managed somewhere far away in a boardroom or somewhere in an international organization with behind closed doors. So we don't have any power of our food, and food is our primary need. So for us, it's very simple in that term, that it's not working. And why isn't it working? But also we have a range of people who are involved in Spire, but we also work very closely with farmers and the farmers unions. So we're kind of the farmers environmental organization, because we see the solutions as well. Yes, we need to reduce meat, but we also need to change how we produce the meat. We can't just reduce it and not change how we do it. If we want to have the just and sustainable world that we're all working for, then we actually need to change how we do things. We can't just cut out something. We need to have a complete overhaul. So I think that's why people are kind of interested in the food system when we're doing it. So we're working with carbon sequestration. As a youth organization, people are just like, why? But that's something that a lot of our members really do care about, because it's a solution, and it's changing so many things. It has such a positive domino effect for a range of things, and finally the farmers feel like they're lifted up as a solution and not just pushed down as a problem, and that's very important as well.
Yeah, Hege, you have actually mentioned to me earlier that you're actually working together with Norwegian farmers to actually put pressure on the Norwegian government. So could you elaborate a bit on this, maybe?
So some of you might have heard of the 4 per 1,000 initiative that was started in 2015 during the Paris Agreement. Norway hasn't signed it. So Norway said that we don't want to, or the government has said that they don't want to be a part of the 4 per 1,000 per now, because we already have a strategy to kind of to take care of the soil. But for us, it doesn't have to be either or. So we've started working with the biggest farmers unions in Norway, and have them signing up, and had a lot of other organizations and municipalities to sign up, so that we can push the government to actually implement this. We've been talking about carbon sequestration for a long time, and there's been a lot of research, and we need to actually start doing it as well and implement those policies. So how do we do it? How can the government shift their subsidies so that it's actually lucrative for the farmers to do this, and have a shift in how they actually produce the food? So it's not just a yield or volume base, it's actually how you cultivate the land and how you take care of biodiversity and all of these things.
I think really that collaboration is super important and interesting, and really a model for collaboration between youth movements and farmers in other countries as well. More questions? Yeah?
Agree very much in most of what's been said. My question is, can you be a little more, but it's also tend to be quite generic and general and at the national level. Could you be a bit more specific on interventions? I mean, for example, at the local level, my impression is I've been working a lot in Sydhavn, that if you organize interventions and change in a local community, then you can sort of untap some of the potential of people living in the city that wants to, I mean, all the urban foodies that want to do vertical farming, that want to do urban agriculture, all these kind of things. Could you give some advice or ideas on how could we maybe work on a little more on the local level? How could we utilize the power that I think is in the city and in the local community of the city? Any advice or ideas?
Ben?
Just from I know there's loads of great work going on in Europe, and Christian mentioned the Food Shift 2030 program, which is bringing together some of those cities taking great action, and all around the world as well. I mean, from a UK perspective, we run something called the Sustainable Food Cities Network, and the two key things to that are this is a place-based approach, not just cities, but other kind of counties or metropolitan boroughs. And it's drawn inspiration from America and Canada around this Food Policy Council model. So a key thing is governance. It's making sure you've got the right people around the table, not just some council officers changing the system. They have a huge role, but also bringing community groups, academics, bringing in civil society, businesses. It's really important to have the right people around the table. And we've seen a lot of food strategies come and go. They're good if they've got a good action plan, but what's more important is that governance model to keep that going. I would also say another key thing that we've insisted on any of these cities, we've now got about 60 places that have joined in the UK, and they can't just decide to join, they have to meet certain criteria. They have to have the right people around the table, and they also have to have that breadth of vision. And I think in terms of the topic of today, I would say this isn't just a climate emergency, it's a climate and nature emergency. And I think it's really important that we look at the breadth of that perspective, because then I think you get the right solutions coming out of that. So from a sustainable food point of view at a city level or a place-based level, that means covering a range of issues. So whether that's food poverty and access to healthy, affordable food, whether that's food waste and the ecological footprint, whether it's public procurement, so looking at school food, hospital food, whether it's looking at support for food enterprises, whether it's around sort of urban food growing, peri-urban food growing, supporting farmers and community skills. And if you don't, as a place, have that breadth of vision, you just haven't got the right people around the table. It's not that that issue isn't important. It is. There will be people in your city suffering from food poverty. There will be issues of food waste. You need to get those right people around the table. You need to support them and make sure, as he was saying earlier, that you've got diverse voices that aren't, and support them to be there as well. I could spend about another hour going into interventions, but one last point I wanted to make was, how do you, great, activity at a local level. You try to work with the schools to make sure that there's more vegetarian options, you're serving less but better meat. You're working to kind of support startup food enterprises that embed that notion of the circular food economy, whether that's doing stuff around, there's a company called Toast Ale in the UK, run by Tristram Stewart, or started up by him, which has used bread that would have otherwise gone to waste and turn it into beer. So that's, it's brilliant, that idea of keeping value in the supply chain. But the last point I wanted to make, sorry, I'm going on, was how do you then mobilize those cities to change those national or international supply chains? So one of the things we do through this network is to run a series of campaigns each year focusing on a different issue. So one example was around fish. We worked with about 20 of the cities to try to get their local caterers to sign up to serve only demonstrably sustainable fish. And we worked nationally with the Marine Stewardship Council, Marine Conservation Society, WWF, the sort of fish experts who can say, these are the species you need to be using. And we had that sort of pincer approach where we would, I suppose, target those catering companies, because there's probably about 4 or 5 huge national catering companies serving the majority of public sector meals, meals in restaurants and like museum cafes, that kind of thing. And where if we knocked on their door nationally, they would say, oh, go away, you're just another one of those shouty civil society groups. But actually working with the people, the council officers and community groups at a local level, where they were then asking for it, in Bristol, in Hull, in Bournemouth, in Durham, in London, all these cities around the UK, the businesses that were then saying, oh, hold on, we're getting demand from our customers to change, so we really need to do this. And so it's led to caterers serving 1 billion meals across the UK now, committing to demonstrably sustainable fish. So I think that is really important to think about how do you mobilize local action with national action. I'll shut up now. Sorry, Christian.
Thanks a lot, Ben, for a very elaborate answer. Hege, you also had a comment on this?
I'll be quick. Well, you already you did touch upon one of the points that I wanted to bring out. It's food policy councils. It's a very inspiring way to actually have real participation by the people living in a city or in an area. And also kind of looking at that in a different way is, and it's based on urban farming, for example, having more participation in what is it going to be when someone wants to develop an area of my city? What is it? How can I actually be a part of this? What kind of power do I have? So pushing for local municipalities and governance to include the people actually living in an area more is important, and also having a broader idea of what is this sustainable development that we're going to have in this area for the city. What should we have? Because urban farming is such a great opportunity to have both environmental and social sustainability, having somewhere that people can actually meet. That would also foster a sense of a belonging, and also a participation in changing our local environment. And when we change our local environments, that can scale up. So then we will have that international, global change that we actually need. And also we work with a partner organization in Malawi. They have model farmers working on climate smart agriculture, where we look at regenerative agriculture, for example, and adaptation. So they have a few model farmers who go out and they teach other farmers how they do it. So then you kind of have this thing just spreading all over, which is also a very important way, is just how having peer-to-peer communication in that way.
Yeah. Thanks, Hege. I think we have another question here.
Thank you. I'm Per Kølster. I'm the chairman of Organic Denmark. I think I would like to mention that Copenhagen is a city where we have been working with the change of food for the last 25 years. We managed to reach a goal saying that we have 90% of the procurement nearly, which is organic. This is a change of the food system. It's a small change in a bigger context, but it's a very important one, because the people who have worked with this, they have been working both with their practical skills, and they have been working with how to change their view on the food system. What happens now is that the municipality has changed their strategy into still being organic, but of course extending it into the more vegetarian diet and so on. This has already been prepared during those 25 years. And another aspect which is very important seen from the cooking side is to come into a much more close contact with the farmers, and to set up a kind of program where it's possible to get the food from the local area. That is the demand from the people working professional in the kitchens. That there we have a problem, because the rules, the laws and so on, they don't support how this can be managed from a market point of view. And there are no farmers who are kind of working closely with a direct kind of bringing food into the city. This is an example, I think, where we have taken a part of the transformation of a food system, but there is a long way to go in order really to reach the goal. And I'd like to mention in this context that I don't hear the word organic farming very much, but people have been working with this for 40 years. And it's a worldwide movement, and it is a very strong social movement also. I think we've forgotten this a little in Denmark because it has become a very commercial thing. But the deep point here is that it is a social movement. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, Per. Do we have any comments from the panel on this? Otherwise, yeah.
Well, I wanted to just talk a bit about at the household level, because I think his question, of course, was related to what's happening in Europe. But I wanted to share just some experiences of how we are trying to change things within the African context, where Andrew spoke earlier about reviving the extension system. So we now have what we call the New Extensionist, which is being promoted by the Africa Forum for Advisory Services, where we are looking at how we can tap into new technologies, like mobile phone technologies, for instance, to make sure that we reach every farmer in the different households in rural Africa. Because we know that there are certain barriers that sort of hinder adaptation and the sort of adoption of climate-smart technologies. So we are working with the advisory services people to make sure that we get the information into the hands of the farmers so that they can make the decisions themselves. But also, I think the other idea is having champions that are from the community that can sort of speak on behalf of these technologies that we're trying to extend so that farmers can adopt them. So whilst we do work at a sort of regional and national level, we appreciate the fact that the real change needs to take place at household level. So we're finding new ways of reaching farmers in their homes. Yeah.
So do you see also kind of what is going on in Africa is very different from Europe? I mean, is the focus different? I mean, in Europe, we have a lot of focus right now on mitigation, and there's this increasing trend towards more plant-based diets. But the challenges are somehow different in Africa.
Well, I think for us in Africa, the emphasis is on adaptation and building resilience of our farmers. So maybe the difference is there. But there's really scope for us to learn from some of the sort of advances that are happening in Europe. But for us, it's really about how do we get our farmers to adapt to the changes that they are already experiencing, and how do we make sure that we build their resilience. In the past season, countries in Southern Africa have been hit by cyclones, and farmers who had sort of moved years in terms of their growth and development were sort of set back. So we don't want to see a situation where when we have natural disasters, our farmers are worse off than they have been. So building resilience and making sure that our farmers adapt to climate change is a priority for us.
Ben? Yeah.
To pick up on, is my mic working? Yeah, there we go. To pick on sorry, I missed your name but the importance of organic, and I think it's something that does get forgotten in this kind of desire to come up with new names and new terms. And I think there's probably a lot to be said about working with organic systems and making sure that we can better sell what importance they have in terms of climate change. I mean, the UK looks very much to Denmark in terms of you have a much higher percentage of organic or demand for organic in the market. So yeah, I mean, there's definitely a lot that we can learn. But I'm just thinking in terms of one of the things that we talk about in the UK and thinking about that sort of collaboration around messaging and framing, talking about eating less but better meat and dairy. Because on one hand we'll have people saying, no, we just got to go vegan. On the other hand we'll say, well, no, there's nothing wrong with meat. And we do need to find and really shout loudly with that more nuanced middle messaging. And then sort of start to translate that into different settings, whether that's public procurement or other places. And I just wanted to say, how many academics, I know I'm asking the audience, how many academics do we have in the audience? Students, people from universities? Okay, I'm going to set you a task. So our slightly ballpark, radical, stupid idea at the moment, if you're looking to shift, if we're seriously looking to shift this, and I think we should be rather serious about this, if If we said, if the UK government, Danish government, and maybe EU said, large businesses, large caterers, large retailers can only sell better meat, as in meat that has been certified to standards that we would probably find. I know there'd be a lot of discussion around what does better look like. Organic is better. I'm not sure what schemes you have in Denmark, certification schemes. In the UK, we've got things like pasture-fed livestock, RSPCA standards. If those large businesses could only sell certified better, what would be the impacts in terms of environmental impacts, job impacts, impacts to business, health? That's the sort of serious change we need to see. And we might find some leaders, some caterers, some retailers leading the way with that before governments take action. That would make meat more expensive, but we need to eat less of it. We probably actually need to be really valuing our food more. I know it's an unsexy argument to say we need to be paying more for our food, but I think farmers would probably agree that they're not being paid enough money for their wonderful produce. So how do you create those systemic changes that actually lead to that? And that's where the academic sector needs to come in, needs to model that, needs to come up with those answers, because we don't want to campaign for something that's going to have a devastating effect on rural livelihoods, that's going to mean that poorer people can't afford meat, for example, or can't afford a balanced diet. My argument would be if you're just looking at large businesses, so supermarkets, actually some of those poorer communities maybe go to ethnic supermarkets or ethnic shops that wouldn't be impacted by this. The idea that you have to we should be making good food more affordable, more accessible, and more attractive. You should have to go further to get the worse options, whether that's unhealthy food, whether that's climate unfriendly food. It should be harder to reach. It shouldn't be so convenient. It shouldn't be so cheap. So how do we try to tweak the system in meaningful ways to do that?
Hege, brief comment on that?
Just a very brief comment. I agree to an extent with what you're saying, but it's also, you need to have an understanding of, especially in Great Britain, class. Because if you have these flat kind of taxes, or if you touched upon it, but yes, if we pay more for meat, that's good. If you pay more for food, you use less money on crap that you don't need, and that's also a good environmental policy, actually. But there's also a class perspective here that needs to be very much put into place, and you can't just kind of squeeze people who are or have wages that are stagnated and are actually struggling to make their way in life, kind of push them out and then say you need to go to these kind of shops, because these shops, that's where all the people who actually contribute to the environmental crisis can go, because they can pay for it. And I think that's what we see now with what happened in Paris and everything with the yellow jackets, or the vest. That's it. It's a class thing. People feel like they're not being pushed out of the whole climate crisis because they can't pay for it, because it's still an individualization of how to tackle this crisis. Because if you tackle it within the market, it's the people who can pay for it who are actually doing the right thing. But are they actually doing the right thing? What is sustainability for your company? Is it that you take who's worse than you and then you kind of go down one level? That's sustainability, or is it an actually kind of like a very low set bar that you need to be under? These things need to be tackled at the same time as well.
I think you're right. I'd like to challenge some of those premises. So we're not in favour of a meat tax because it would provide that level playing field, making it more expensive. I'm saying about actually look at where those different communities might shop. Also, we don't have a right to meat. So we have a right to food. I think that any large-scale interventions like that to shift diets, and we do need to eat less meat, so we need to find ways in which we can do it in a more substantial way. They need to go hand in hand with those sorts of initiatives that actually make good food more affordable for low-income communities. And this is a big part of our work at Sustain, is working across the UK with those communities and working on those initiatives where you can. So free school meals, I think I know Sweden, Finland's are brilliant in terms of providing free school meals. It's something I think Denmark doesn't do, but that should be a kind of a first way of making sure that particularly children from families on low income have access to a balanced diet, and that will include some meat, obviously within a school meal setting.
I think we have to wrap up, unfortunately. soon the discussion here. Before we wrap up, I would actually like to ask if there are also representatives from the social movement here today who would kind of identify themselves as that. Do you have any questions here? A final question maybe? Yes?
My name is Busk. I'm from Friends of the Earth, Denmark. I think we have a paradox. I heard some of the speakers mention the concept food sovereignty. On the other hand side, maybe the key word during this conference has been collaboration, partnership. Now, in my head, food sovereignty is about liberating ourselves, farmers, consumers, from the dominance of multinational giants in technological farming or farming technology, in chemical seeds and so on, and in retailing. I would like you to your opinion about this maybe problem.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think I'm
Yes,
the culprit who sort of brought that up. Okay, so for me, food sovereignty, there's no one size fits all to it. I think it's something that sort of adapts to people, to different places in how it's put into practice. But I think the key idea for me is the fact that it's about making sure that there's solidarity, that there is no competition, and that we are building a fairer world where those that are disadvantaged also have access to food. I think that's the point that I wanted to sort of bring up. Yeah.
That's a very good point indeed, and I think we could be continue discussing this for the rest of the day actually. Unfortunately, we have to wrap up. But kind of inspired by actually the Green youth movement here in Denmark, who invited recently for the Fridays for Future, they invited also all grown-ups to join an afternoon to make a generation contract, between everybody below 30 and everybody above 30. Then I think actually we need a similar contract here between the social movements and the farmers. And actually at this event, they split up, a big space in two. But they had on one side everybody below 30, on one side everybody above 30. And then everybody came together, shook their hands, and kind of promised to commit to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Due to the logistics of this room and the time, unfortunately, I'm not going to suggest this, but what I would suggest is that farmer organizations and social movements go together and make such a contract. Because we actually do share the same vision. We all want to transform the food system to better meet the needs of the people and the planet. So we need to acknowledge that farmers need to earn a living, and we need to acknowledge that citizens, they have the right to healthy, sustainable food. So with that, I would like to conclude the session and actually invite you for lunch. I'm not totally sure it's plant-based. But in any case, there is lunch. The doors here will open soon, and there will also be lunch upstairs. So before you go for lunch, just remember one thing: only take on your plate what you can eat, because the remainder will actually be donated. Yeah. So thanks for participating.